There's a reason why 90s fall fashion hits different. Maybe it's the absence of irony. Or maybe it's the fact that everything was ironic, but no one said it out loud. You just wore a huge coat, didn't explain anything, and that was your whole personality. And people respected that. Autumn in the 90s wasn't cozy. It wasn't pumpkin-colored or cinnamon-flavored. It was beige. It was ash gray. It was the color of a bad mood on a Monday morning in November. And somehow, that was chic. People didn't wear scarves because they were cute. They wore them because life was hard and heating was expensive. The models didn't smile. The clothes didn't sparkle. If your lipstick wasn't slightly brown and your roots slightly grown out, were you even participating? Campaigns were moody, lit like indie films. You had Kate Moss looking like she just left someone's loft in Berlin at 6 a.m. You had Shalom Harlow standing in a field in a Max Mara coat, giving pure, I'm going through something energy. Everyone looked like they were either on the verge of a nervous breakdown or writing poetry about one. It was perfect. Back then, fashion didn't chase you down with trend cycles and AI-generated dopamine dressing. It stood on the street corner, smoking, looking away. And if you noticed it, fine. If not, it didn't care. Brands like Calvin Klein, Jil Sander, Donna Karan, they didn't need to scream. They barely even spoke. Their version of fall was silence, minimalism, and really good tailoring. Let's talk about the fabrics. Wool that looked itchy, but was probably $800. Leather so structured it could have filed your taxes. Suede in impractical colors. Long skirts with slits you didn't notice until someone walked away dramatically. These clothes weren't made for Instagram. They were made for trains, bookstores, awkward conversations, and overcast cities. And then there was the makeup, or the refusal of it. Foundation was barely there. Eyeshadow was brown, if anything. Mascara was for the bold. Lipstick was either plum or nothing. It was the era when looking done was the opposite of cool. The goal was to appear like you had better things to do than care, even if you deeply did. What made 90s fall fashion so powerful was the mix of restraint and emotion. Everything was held back. Colors, shapes, words. But underneath it all, you could feel something. Melancholy? Maybe. Desire? Probably. A longing to be seen without performing? Definitely. Try to imagine that in 2025, when fashion is all algorithm and aesthetics are served on speed. Now everyone wants to be the main character. In the 90s, you were just trying to get through the day in a great coat, with dignity. And that, honestly, might have been the better look. So yes, bring back the camel overcoats. Bring back the moody eyes. Bring back the women who looked like they had somewhere to be, but weren't going to tell you where. Let fall be fall again. Quiet, cold, and dressed in Donna Karan, and let's not forget the hair. Fall in the 90s wasn't about beachy waves or salon blowouts with names like Cashmere Volume. Hair just sort of existed. It hung there, slightly flat, slightly heavy, as if it too was processing something. You had Winona Ryder's perfect boyish crop, sharp, unapologetic. You had the undone buns, the sleek middle parts, the wet looks that said, I've had enough. If your hair looked a little sad, it matched your coat. That was the point. Fashion wasn't trying to heal you. It wasn't pretending to be therapeutic or inclusive or sustainable. It didn't smile at you in pastel colors and tell you it loved your body. No. It looked you dead in the eye, handed you a knee-length leather skirt, and said, figure it out. Models weren't relatable. They were untouchable. Naomi, Linda, Christy, Helena. They weren't interested in your opinion. They weren't trying to connect. They were statues in motion. And yet, somehow, They felt more real than today's airbrushed, algorithm-approved influencers. Because mystery is a form of intimacy, and the 90s were fluent in both. Look at the campaigns, not the ones you remember, the ones in the back of the magazine, the ones lit like film noir scenes in a hotel room you'd never afford. Everything had shadows. Everything looked like it had a secret. That Max Mara coat, it had been places. That Donna Karan turtleneck, it had survived a divorce. That camel blazer, it knew what betrayal smelled like. These were clothes for adults, not in the boring grown-up sense, in the sense that they came with consequences. You didn't wear a long black coat and expect to be cheerful. You wore it because it made you feel protected, powerful, maybe even slightly feared. There was no girl math or capsule wardrobe discourse. There was just you, a paycheck, and the quiet thrill of buying something so timeless it might outlive your optimism. There's a reason we keep coming back to 90s fall fashion year after year. It's not just nostalgia. It's not even about the aesthetics. It's about the mood, the calm, the restraint, the elegance of not oversharing. The way a woman could walk down the street in a black coat, no logos, no gimmicks, and still be unforgettable. Try that now. You'll get eaten alive by trends before you make it to the subway. And here's the kicker. Back then, nobody called it curating a vibe. They just had one. Fall in the 90s wasn't content. It was character. It was the sound of boots on wet pavement, the way your sleeves smelled like cigarette smoke and expensive soap. It was sitting in a cafe alone, reading Joan Didion, and pretending you weren't waiting for someone who'd never show up. Designers knew this. That's why their autumn collections weren't just clothes. They were weather systems. Calvin Klein would send out a model in a slip dress and an oversized trench, and the room would go quiet. Not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar, like recognizing your own silence on a runway. Even the chaos was elegant. Grunge didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like honesty. Marc Jacobs wasn't designing for pretty girls. He was designing for girls who felt too much and said too little. The cardigan hanging off one shoulder? That wasn't styling. That was life. And then there were the men. Yes, men's fashion in the 90s also had a fall phase. One worth remembering. There were long wool coats that made boys look like poets. There were suits that didn't scream banker. They whispered, "I've read something tragic." There was the rise of minimalism in menswear, too. Helmut Lang, Jil Sander for men, Armani's soft tailoring. Masculinity got a little quieter, a little sadder, and frankly, more interesting. Because in the 90s, everyone looked a little broken, but in a beautiful way. Fall wasn't a season you dressed for. It was a mood you entered, and fashion followed. You didn't wear bright colors because life already felt too loud. You wore gray because it let your thoughts echo. And honestly, that's what's missing now. We're in a world where everything is curated to be liked before it's lived in. Fashion isn't worn, it's performed. There's no dust, no creases, no history. But fall 90s fashion, it had history built in. Even the new things felt like they'd already meant something to someone else. That's why vintage hits different. Not because of the quality, though let's be real, the quality was better, but because the clothes came from an era that meant it. Nobody was designing for clicks or hoping to go viral. They were designing because they had an idea, a vision. And sometimes that vision was just a woman walking home alone in a trench coat after making the right decision too late. Is that a mood board or a memoir? Exactly. You see, fashion in the 90s, didn't ask for your approval. It didn't try to look like something else. It wasn't pretending to be vintage. It was vintage. It wasn't inspired by old money. It was the time when people either had money or pretended not to. Beautifully. And autumn? Autumn was when fashion got serious. Summer was for flings and florals. Fall was for real clothes and real decisions. You started layering. You started thinking. You started putting away the lies you told yourself in July. Every look felt like a confession or a cover-up. A long coat wasn't just for warmth. It was a defense mechanism. A ribbed turtleneck meant you were protecting your throat, your most vulnerable part. Knee-high boots, not made for running, made for standing still in the right place and waiting for something to happen. Maybe love, maybe a train, maybe both. There was always movement in stillness. Even the most minimal campaigns had tension. Carolyn Bessette in an off-white coat. Amber Valletta standing under a bridge. You couldn't tell if she was running from something or just bored. Either way, it looked good. You weren't expected to smile. You were expected to be. Just be. Be graceful. Be slightly annoyed. Be completely detached. The point was, your inner life mattered more than your outer glow. That's why makeup was nearly invisible. That's why eyes were dark and lips were matte and no one wore highlighter. You glowed from anxiety and art school, not product. In the 90s, fall fashion knew the difference between quiet and empty. It wasn't loud, but it had weight. Clothes had structure, stories, spine. A wool coat wasn't soft. It had an opinion. A slip dress wasn't flirty. It was confrontation with fabric. These weren't garments designed to be seen on TikTok for 7 seconds and discarded. They were made to be worn into moments. To show up at a dinner you shouldn't be at. To bump into an ex and look exactly like they feared you would. And even when trends leaned weird, and let's not forget the weirdness, it was never try hard. The chokers, the sheer shirts, the combat boots with tiny Prada bags, all iconic, but also not ironic. They were worn earnestly, even when they looked ridiculous, especially when they looked ridiculous. That's the secret. Because if the 80s dressed like it was yelling, the 90s dressed like it had nothing left to say, and that's always more interesting. Even now, when you go thrifting, what do you look for? 90s coats, 90s boots, 90s suits. That era had proportions you trust. Fabrics that feel like they've been somewhere. Shapes that leave room for your thoughts. We live in a time where everyone wants to channel something. Channel old money, channel cool French girls, channel 90s icons. Back then, nobody channeled anything. They just got dressed. And somehow, that's what made it unforgettable. It was fashion that didn't try to go viral and ended up eternal. So now, every September, we scroll through Pinterest and pull out the camel coats again. We rewatch old Calvin Klein ads. We Google Carolyn's wedding dress for the 1,000th time. We want that feeling. That slightly sad, slightly stylish, deeply personal version of fall. Not because it's trendy, but because it's human. And maybe that's the real point. Maybe 90s autumn fashion reminds us of when clothes still had a pulse. When getting dressed felt like creating a character, not selling one. When silence was powerful, melancholy was elegant, and a good coat could say everything you couldn't. No filters, no slogans, just you. In a black turtleneck. On a gray day. Looking like a mood no one can name. But everyone remembers.